Classical Sociological Theory, Part 2 of Lecture on Emil Durkheim. So Durkheim made some contributions and theories on institution of education. And education, he believed that education served many functions. The first of which is to reinforce social solidarity. For example, saying the Pledge of Allegiance sort of makes individuals feel part of a group and therefore less likely to break rules. He also believed that education served the function of maintaining social roles. School is a society in miniature and has a similar hierarchy, rules, and expectations to the outside world, thus training people to really fulfill those rules, preparing the next generation of workers. And lastly, one of the functions Durkheim viewed education as serving is to maintain the division of labor. He believes schools sort students into skill groups, encouraging students to take up employment in fields that are best suited to their abilities. So along with sociology, Durkheim was also trained in pedagogy and concluded that the institution of public education was a necessary replacement for religion in a secular society. Also, Durkheim's also made a contribution to anomie. Anomie is defined as the breakdown of social norms that regulate our behavior. Durkheim and other sociological theorists coined the term anomie as a, quote, reaction against or retreat from the social controls of society, end quote. All deviant behavior, Durkheim believed, stems from a state of anomie, and including suicide, which he studied extensively. Another contribution that Durkheim made was to crime. He believed crime served a social function, meaning that it has a purpose in society. And he saw crime as being able to release certain tensions, social tensions, and so have a cleansing or purging effect in society. And his views on crime were pretty unconventional during that time period. As we were discussing in class, we went over some examples of social facts. And social facts, according to Durkheim, are the subject matter of sociology. They are the sui generis and must be studied as distinct from biological and psychological phenomenon. Durkheim argues that society has its own reality, what he calls this sui generis reality. And that means that it is a collective reality that exerts its own force, independent of individuals. Genus is the Latin for group. Sui generis translates to of the group in and of itself. And so for Durkheim, social facts can be defined as patterns of behavior that are capable of exercising some coercive power upon individuals. So those social forces in society sort of control an individual's behavior. They are the guides and controls of conduct and are external to the individual in the form of the norms and the mores and the folkways. Norms, mores, folkways are sort of the rules of our behavior. As quoted in Durkheim's work, The Rules of Sociological Method, quote, a social fact is identifiable through the power of external coercion, which it exerts or is capable of exerting upon individuals, end quote. So Durkheim believed that through socialization and education, these rules became internalized in the consciousness of the individual. These constraints, these guides become our moral obligations to obey the social rules. There's an additional concept of this sort of dual consciousness or human dualism. In the Division of Labor and Society, written by Durkheim, he quotes that there are in each of us two consciousnesses, one which is common to our group in its entirety. The other, on the contrary, represents that in us which is personal and distinct, that makes us an individual. End quote. He writes in the Elementary Forms of Religious Life that because society surpasses us, it obliges us to surpass ourselves, and to surpass itself, a being must, to some degree, depart from its nature, a departure that does not take place without causing more or less painful tensions. So, in other words, he recognizes sort of that there may be some sort of conflict or tension um, in this dualism between the individual and society. Again, he mentions in the Elementary Forms of Religious Life, it is not without reason, therefore, that man feels himself to be double. He actually is double. In brief, his duality corresponds to the double existence that we lead concurrently, the one purely individual and rooted in our organisms, and the other social and nothing but an extension of society. And the sort of hints of theorists we're going to be talking about, and W.E.B. Du Bois and his concept of double consciousness. Durkheim sees this as our purely individual side seeking satisfaction of all its wants and desires. And so that individual desires, those individual wants knows no boundaries. So without being constrained by the collective consciousness, this side of human beings may lead to the condition that Durkheim labels as anomie. And so here we see sort of a visualization of, at the center of the circle is the individual's insatiable desires, insatiable appetites, the in-group, the arena of that moral conformity. So within that circle, we're encircled by that collective consciousness, and outside of that circle, outside is the law, the rules that sort of keeps us in check, keeps us sort of constrained. Sort of this idea. So visually, kind of also there's hints of Freud in this. Anybody who's interested in or studies psychology. In 1897, Suicide was published, and so Durkheim's goal in his work Suicide, was to show that an individual act is actually the result of social factors. So that's the relevance of the sociological perspective. And he defines suicide as the act of severing social relationships. And Durkheim observed that abnormally high or low levels of social integration may result in increased suicide rates. So he looked at and evaluated and studied and researched the level of connectedness individuals have in their social world. The results he found included for one, that suicide rates are higher for widowed, single, or divorced people rather than those who are married. So having that sort of connection with a commitment with someone sort of makes that person more connected in a relationship, in a marriage. And secondly, rates are higher for those who have no children rather than those who do. Again, having that sort of familial responsibility, having children that depend on us. He saw rates were higher among Protestants than Catholics. So again, he's extensively studied religion as well, and in support of that, coroners in a Catholic country are less likely to record suicide as the reason of death, because in Catholicism, suicide is considered a sin. And so when he studied religion, again, the tenets of Protestantism versus Catholicism stood out as sort of lacking that sort of connectedness or that communal relationship. And Durkheim's argument in Suicide is that human's desire is unlimited. There's no internal check on our needs and our desires. The passions must be limited, but this must be done by some force exterior to the individual. This exterior force must be the community or that collective conscience, because it is the only moral power superior to the individual, that it's the authority of which that one person or that individual accepts. Regulation of our individual needs and wants through the collective consciousness is required to ensure that people will accept their position in life, because true social equality is impossible. Durkheim argues that anomie occurs in societies where there's a breakdown or a pass through some abnormal crisis. For example, a recession, or when, a revolution, like they were seeing, the Industrial Revolution. People are not quite adjusted to those conditions that have been forced upon them. And so those social bonds, that collective conscience, fail to work the regulation that they typically would do. And so that anomie causes a breakdown in that social control. Now, according to Durkheim, he sort of classified suicide into 4 types, and you'll read this in the chapter. He believes suicide causes weak social bonds. It might be caused by weak social bonds. And those social bonds are made up of that social integration, that social connectedness and social regulation. So the 4 types of suicide, according to Durkheim, are egoistic, altruistic, anomic, and fatalistic. In egoistic suicide, the individual is weakly integrated in society. So ending their life will have little impact on the rest of society. Altruistic, on the other hand, is where the individual is extremely attached to the society, and because of this, has no real sense of autonomy. Alternatively, it's a freely chosen act of self-sacrifice. So altruism is sort of this self-sacrificing. We use this as a concept in family. Altruistic love is sort of this self-sacrificing love for another. And in Durkheim's case, when he talks about suicide, it's sort of that chosen act of self-sacrifice. Anomic suicide is sort of, again, a weak social regulation between society's norms and the individual, and it most often is brought on by sort of a dramatic economic or social change. You see a lot of people during a time of recession or depression where they've lost all their money, or they're someone is a gambler, there's an addiction to gambling, and they lose all their money, and so that would be an example of anomic suicide. Fatalistic suicide is where social regulation is completely imposed upon the individual. No hope of countering the oppressive discipline of the society. And the only way to escape is to take one's own life. So again, very fatalistic. And here we see a diagram where altruistic and egoistic are at two ends of the spectrum, and where you have anomic and fatalistic. Fatalistic, too much regulation; anomic, not enough regulation; altruistic, too much integration; and egoistic, not enough integration. So they're on 2 scales. And this is according to authors Durkheim, Elem, and Berger, and they sort of created a sort of cross tabulation, so to speak, of group attachment behavior regulation, where one is high or one is low versus high or strong, low or weak. You'll find group attachment, for example, on the social integration and shared social sentiments. Altruistic is sort of collectivistic, where it's low or weak, you have more egoistic or individualistic suicide. And where on the behavioral regulation, that moral regulation, the external constraints of man and society, where there's a reduction in it's more hopelessness, it's more fatalistic, and then anomic, where you feel like life is meaningless, and so that would be the anomic or anomic suicide. And some instances or some examples of excessive integration, sort of an occult situation, or kamikaze pilots in 1945, suicide-type bombers, Jonestown massacre, very altruistic, self-sacrificing. That's what they were, they're sacrificing their lives for the cause. Um, Kurt Cobain, again, very low integrated, um, committed suicide, and very egoistic, low integration example of that. Marilyn Monroe, anybody who knows Marilyn Monroe, low regulation, anomic suicide in her case. And then here you have examples of where there is excessive regulation. Again, in the case of slavery, again, very fatalistic illustrations of where people encountered, abusive, excessive regulation of their lives and just saw no other way out. Another breakdown comparing rates of anomic suicide, where in Durkheim's time, looking at higher or lower across the cells. So you see higher among men, lower among women, higher Protestants, lower Catholics, higher Catholics, but yet lower among Jewish, urban versus rural, single versus married, married without children versus married with children. Then you have officers and versus enlisted personnel, military in peace versus military in war. And in more modern days, examples in comparing rates of anomic suicide, we see it higher among adolescents than adults, lower among adults, higher among Native Americans versus lower in Euro Americans. In fact, I know from studying the family and social problems, there are higher suicides among Native Americans are extremely high. Again, and if you look at Native American life, you can see a lot of examples of, Durkheim's theory in applying, self regulation and the interconnectedness that Native Americans have. And the last category, higher among middle-aged versus the elderly. And here, just to provoke some thought amongst you, during times of economic troubles, depression, the depression of the 1930s, when people lost everything. You saw a lot of people, jumping out of windows and, ending their lives because they lost everything and felt, that there was nothing that they could do. Which brings us to Durkheim's discussion of the religious life. His work was called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. Durkheim thought religion was a form of social cohesion, which holds complex societies together. Again, very functionalist in thought, keeping societies stable. So whereas Durkheim saw it as a sort of social cohesion, Marx, in comparison, saw religion as sort of this opioid of the masses. That's what he called it. And he saw religion sort of being this glue that really sticks to people and sticks to them. So Durkheim interprets it as more of a cohesionness. And he looked at more primitive, again, some forms of religious life, and he saw totemism as the original form of religion because it was the emblem for a clan or a social group. And he believed that the function of religion was to make people willing to put the interest of others ahead of themselves. Anyone who's part of a religious denomination or faith. I'll give you an example from my particular faith. I'm was raised in the Roman Catholic Church, and we're always taught to think of others or treat others as you would want to be treated, and those sorts of undertones have always sort of professed to us, as I remember growing up in the faith. And so Durkheim saw this model for relationships between people. And the supernatural was this relationship between individuals in the community. God is society, right? He saw religion as this mechanism that protected um, a, a social order that was ultimately being threatened in some way. So religion is defined, and this is the definition that you'll see everywhere, as quoted by Durkheim, is a quote, religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relating to sacred things, which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. And so he distinguished between sacred and profane, sacred taking on that otherworldly belief, and the profane more of everyday, ordinary objects. So Durkheim studies religion as this fundamental institution of social life upon which the collective identity of individuals are structured. Religion unites members through the creation of a collective consciousness, all religious expression being founded on the identification of members to a group. You see those of a Christian faith, they may wear a cross. They may wear certain clothing that sort of represents maybe their faith or Muslim faith or Jewish faith. I know women often cover their hair after marriage and wear modest clothing. So definitely expressions of, you know, um, how someone dresses or symbolizes the faith that they belong to, sort of that outward identification to other members of the group. And that shared religious belief, those shared religious beliefs and values also reinforce the strength of their collective conscience. So why did Durkheim study primitive society in order to understand religion? He believed early development can be observed and and the change can be traced over time. Sort of looked at it in terms of an evolutionary model. And when you look at things in terms of revolutionary versus evolutionary, revolution is like it's like sudden change, revolutionary change, but evolutionary takes place over time. And it's often slower. And Durkheim looked for these elements which constitute that which is permanent and human in religion. And he believed they form all the objective contents of the idea which is expressed when one speaks of religion in general. And this is from, again, his text, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. Durkheim also thought that simplicity allows for an analysis of the essential feature. So going back to its primitive form sort of simplifies and goes back to its maybe original tenets, and sort of examining it from there is where he thought would be the best way to look for those essential features. Everything is common, according to Durkheim in his Elementary Forms text. He quotes, everything is common to all. Movements are stereotyped. Everybody performs the same ones in the same circumstances. And this conformity of conduct only translates to the conformity of thought. So those behaviors, this is my interpretation, those behaviors that are then, sort of express, or sort of like when I know, again, I'm going to use myself as an example again. If you go into church, we do the sign of the cross, people kneel or they bow and they recite or chant some prayers, however you want to call that. We pray, repeating the same uh, prayers, and so everybody knows the words to those prayers, and so that becomes sort of this this way to connect with each other. And so societies are different enough from our own experience that we're able to see those important features that stand out, especially, again, if you look at it in terms of what does an outsider see in this particular faith. Okay, so distinguishing the sacred versus the profane. Um, Durkheim saw religion being defined by the cultural distinction between the sacred and the profane. Sacred objects are objects that are extraordinary and set apart, whereas profane are those objects that are sort of everyday, ordinary objects. Now, something can be profane, and for some who do not believe in it as a sacred object. So take, for example, a menorah in the Jewish faith at Hanukkah. It's considered a sacred object. If you're not a member of a Jewish faith, a menorah could just be a candlestick holder or, a candelabra. So that would be in the profane form, but when it's used in terms of the celebration of Hanukkah, it is menorah and it is considered sacred. So the notions of the sacred are given external representation through objects or symbols, called these collective representation. This is because this collective believes it's so. Here you see sort of a little roadmap of Durkheim's model of religious evolution. And so we start with these temporary gatherings that occur, and then these sort of interactions escalate, where sort of the crowds get heightened with emotion and collective feeling, and then the sense of common sentiments that are sort of external. I know in studying again, briefly about religion, that people who take pilgrimages, there's the Hajj, Mecca, the retreat to Mecca. People come back feeling very moved. They have these sort of these expressions of outer bodiedness, or sort of this external feeling of I don't know how to put this into words again, because it's a very religious experience. So religion is seen as, sort of ritual. There's some rituals involved, and then there are other beliefs, and then there are the experiences. So that's sort of common things that all religious faiths have. They share within them. They have a series of rituals, a series of beliefs or tenets, however you like to call them, and then you have some experiences. And so these religious experiences are found in the terms of, put it in God's hands. I'm trying to think of some of those expressions. So people, feeling like this, coming back from the Hajj, having had this really profound religious experience. And so those powers, that feeling is attributed to mana, and mana being this psychological need to represent with a material object, this sort of mana, this structural need for that solidarity, this cultural need for resulting in that permanent, that group, that symbolism. That mana is sort of symbolized by the totem that Durkheim, we see him referred to as the totem, the sacred object of the totem. Totems sort of promote the sense of unity, solidarity among its members. And sort of that all relates back and gives it the powers that are attributed to it. On here, the thinking about, again, reflecting the question is raised, is this the collective conscious, this effervescence, and again, in this pilgrimage to Hajj, is it when we feel we are part of something bigger than ourselves? Okay, right. I've had students who actually, if a student shared experience with the class, it was an introduction to sociology class. The student shared their family member went on the pilgrimage, and when they came back, they had felt this really profound experiences. almost described it in terms of an effervescence. And that, according to Durkheim, would be these vital energies, these passions, uh, sensations that are really strong. A man does not recognize himself. He feels almost transformational, and transforms the environment that surrounds him. It occurs when we collectively share this experience. So that's why so many people going on these pilgrimages sort of share in this. Um, ecstasis, ecstatic is the word, and so in Greek, ecstasis literally means stepping outside our reality. We might see ourselves again beside ourselves. Um, you know, again, taking it out of beyond our own experience and put it into, um, a higher power's hands. So these social categories, according to Durkheim, shape, he believes, collective conscience and religion sort of shape how we think, how we orient ourselves in terms of time and space and quality, establishing these basic categories of thought. If men do not agree upon these essential ideas at every moment, all contact between their minds would be impossible, and with that, all life together. Thus, societies could not abandon the categories to the free choice of the individual without abandoning themselves. So it's the basic categories of individual thought. And the collective conscience is what guides our human action. We, according to Durkheim, have the feeling that we cannot abandon them if our whole thought is not to cease being fully human. So he viewed this as a way that religion helps us to express and reaffirm these shared social beliefs. It's sort of a functional element of society. And according to Durkheim, there can be no society which does not feel the need of upholding and reaffirming at regular intervals the collective sentiments and the collective ideas. So whenever you see that collective, sure he's referring to societal. And this moral remaking cannot be achieved except by the means of reunions, assemblies, meetings where individuals reaffirm their common sentiments. Okay, and lastly is Durkheim's legacy. Durkheim helped make the study of sociology mainstream. Sociology has gained tremendous popularity. And again, we know Auguste Comte as the father of sociology itself, but it really was Durkheim that made it more of a mainstream discipline. And many of Durkheim's students pursued his ideas in their studies, so a lot of his theories have really withstood the test of time. He's had theories that have both explanatory and predictive power. He founded the academic journal, the L'Année Sociologique. In recent decades, Durkheim's philosophies have been very much influential in the United States and Britain, more so than in France, which was his native country. Durkheim's ideas have influenced several major theoretical movements into the 20th century, and his work was strongly present in the emergence of the structuralism. You know how we call it's structural functionalism. So the emergence of the structuralism through Jean Piaget's work and Claude Levi-Strauss's work. So his legacy lives on.